So I'm here to discuss how we can choose wisely in African participation in oncology clinical trials. In other words, how in Africa's efforts to close the gap, how in Africa's efforts to close the gap in the clinical trial space in Africa, we can still make wise decisions and wise choices. Clinical trial is the next frontier for growth for Africa. And why do I say that? I say that because the conduct of clinical trials is high on the list of enterprises which can leapfrog Africa into the recommendation of ranking bodies like Bloomberg. If we agree, we've noticed that almost all presentations have brought in clinical trials. And if you go to high-income countries, they will tell you that 80% of the cancer patients are all on one clinical trial or the other. And we've, heard the case of what is happening with the hematological cancer in Ife. And I happen to know that patients with, spending almost like 500,000 on the patients for, I think, per cycle. We had a hematologist from Ife who was there at the Breaking Bad News and still saying that we are losing patients to follow up. So clinical trials will help Africa adopt new technologies and develop capacity to nurture innovation as the only strategy which has the capacity to move Africa up the developmental ladder. And it's not only patients that have an advantage, even the workforce are better skilled as they participate in the clinical trial process. So it is not a hidden fact that clinical trials are the mainstay in new drug development processes and for obtaining product license extensions for existing therapies. And yet, though Africa has the world's highest burden of disease amongst its fast-growing population, the low clinical trial volume which it enjoys ensures that almost no drug development and little pharmaceutical research takes place on the continent. So let's look at this inequity that though the African continent represents 15% of the world's population, it only enjoys an overwhelming, it actually enjoys an overwhelming global disease burden of 25%. That is, there's, the balance is really much. We're enjoying 25% of disease burden, whereas we comprise 15% of the world's population. And hold your breath, the region only accounts for 2% of global research. I mean 2% of research in the world. It is indeed preposterous to note that clinical trials is actually critical to addressing the disproportionately high burden of communicable diseases, e.g. HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and non-communicable diseases, which they have now 75% of the burden. For example, diabetes. In developing countries, an imperative for identification of efficient and effective new diagnostic and treatment modalities. Indeed, almost none of the drugs that we administer to our patients on the continent are optimized for the African population of patients. So this imbalance also means that diseases that are disproportionately affect Africans work like the set of diseases which notably are referred to as the neglected diseases of the developing nations. In fact, some people are quite specific to say neglected diseases of the African nation, that they are totally not even included in the clinical trial process because it's not their own burden, it's our own burden. Additionally, literature notes that when new drugs are discovered, the formulas are normally patented by foreign pharmaceutical companies, and their costs then become too great for many African patients. So after doing the clinical trial, they were challenged that the population that participated in the trial will not be able to use it. And they were totally unapologetic. They said it was not meant for that population. So there's also that ethical view that if a particular medication is not going to be affordable to that population, it's not ethically right to have them participate. So you need to make it available to that population as part of the negotiation. So the continued low volumes and paucity of clinical trials in Africa underscores and continues to propel the following serious detrimental implications for the health of the population in the continent. The next, lack of suitable medical solutions that are tailored for African population, which in turn results in slow development of the African healthcare system. We have seen it being represented in most of the conversations. Limited progress in understanding the African genome. Those who were in Lagos last week would understand that definitely there's a huge disparity and a huge gap that we still need to overcome. Unavailability of evidence-based local data. We are always importing data. We need to generate our own germane data. Some of our profound African clinical trialists in the diaspora have actually expressed alarm that this continued poor volume of clinical trials in the region indeed constitutes the real exploitation of the vulnerable population of the African continent. They argue that by providing treatment options that are not verified through clinical trials in that population, we create a window for managing African patient populations with treatments that may not be applicable to them and which may not have the expected efficacy that was proven in the populations in which the drugs and treatments were tried. It's not a one-cap-fits-all. Definitely, we have seen that with genomic research. So here is what I consider a ray of hope in the horizon, because current trends is showing that Africa is actually slowly, gradually, and doggedly emerging as an important clinical trial destination. And over the past decade, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of registered clinical trials, so much so that some experts are already asking us to apply caution in embracing the clinical trial process, because we may have certain studies that will be taking advantage of the vulnerable population. But I think that it's a bit far-fetched, because there's been a lot of training of the research population, such that, you know, there's ethical training going on, GCP training going on, a responsible conduct of research in, you know, human population. So there's a sensitized community of researchers, and I would like to believe that we just have a few parts of the scientific population that are not yet exposed. So the number of registered clinical trials has increased by 3.006% from the year 2000, and about 5,635 cases to 2014, as September 19, 2014, to 175,000 number. So currently, all major pharmaceutical companies have their presence in Africa. The reason why the attractiveness index has increased is because there is the disease burden is huge. So recruitment is faster, and the amount of money, which at first they thought to be higher to conduct clinical trials in the African terrain, they have found out that, they are getting away with cheaper costs in the African nation. Since Africa is beginning to show itself as a plausible clinical trial destination route, the onus is on us as stakeholders in this ecosystem to devise strategies to optimize opportunities and boost the volume of ethically conducted clinical trials in the African region. So how can we work together to power this new wave? And I would like us to, first of all, how to promote African participation in clinical trials and ensure that the international community chooses wisely. And we have several key considerations which we need to look into. And one of them is equitable research partnerships. We need to foster equitable research partnerships between international institutions and African counterparts. And we saw this playing out at the just ended genomic conference that we had. We had a lot of international institutions, representatives from different research centers in America, and we had African counterparts there presenting collaborative research work that they had done. So this will involve, establishing collaborations that prioritize shared decision-making, respect for local context, and capacity building within the African research institutions. Covenant University, presented a lot of students who were doing really profound work. Such partnerships should involve early engagement with African stakeholders, including governments, regulatory bodies, healthcare professionals, and community representatives. Right now, we are still having challenges with navigating our regulatory body, even though there has been an effort to harmonize regulations across Africa. Then the next one is the local context and cultural sensitivity. So we need to recognize and respect the local context and cultural sensitivities in African countries, as Professor Che was talking about the HPV vaccination. So when designing and implementing clinical trials, considerations should include language barriers, cultural beliefs, healthcare practices, and socioeconomic factors that may impact recruitment and retention of participants. Conducting community engagement activities also would need to be done to educate and involve the local communities, and it will help to build trust and address concerns. In fact, in one of the presentations made by a patient advocate who also runs care for patients, she said that they were involved in a clinical trial, and the problem that they found in recruitment was that there was a lack of trust of the patient population with their caregivers. So capacity building and training is the next one. We need to support capacity building initiatives that enhance research infrastructure, training, and education within African countries. And I want to thank CITE and CAPTC and some other groups that have come into the country. I think Professor Alatishe, yes, these three groups have really done profound things in Nigeria. So this can include providing training programs for researchers, healthcare professionals, and ethics committee members, which Association for Good Clinical Practice has been doing since 2006, to strengthen their skills and knowledge in conducting and overseeing clinical trials. Capacity building efforts need to also focus on improving data management, and regulatory compliance and ethical standards. So ethical considerations and informed consent is very important to ensure that ethical principles and informed consent processes are strictly followed in clinical trials conducted in Africa. In fact, in the initial clinical trials volume that increased in Nigeria was around HIV/AIDS, and they found a lot of problems with the informed consent process. that were not abided by. This involves obtaining informed consent from participants in a culturally sensitive manner, using appropriate language and providing adequate information about the study. Ethical review boards and regulatory bodies should play an active role in ensuring the protection of the participants' rights and welfare. Of course, we know what happened in Kanu and the involvement of a non-existent ethical review board. So access to investigational products, address the issue of access to investigational products in African countries participating in clinical trials, collaborate with pharmaceutical companies, regulatory authorities, and international organizations to facilitate access to potentially life-saving treatments and medications for trial participants after the completion of the study, just as I mentioned what happened in India, particularly if they have shown positive outcomes. So clinical trial sites should have an in-house lawyer. So there's a legal department that actually does the negotiation between the sponsor and the hospital where these clinical trials are cited to ensure that these areas are handled. Data sharing and transparency. I know that Dr. Lashebekwa and myself talked about it about one of the projects we did. We need to promote data sharing and transparency in clinical trials conducted in Africa. Ensure that research findings are disseminated widely, including within local African communities. So if you do not, take care of these negotiations beforehand, you may find that after you've done the clinical trial, even you, who was part of the researchers conducting that clinical trial, may never have access to that data. To foster transparency and maximize benefits of research participants. So we need to encourage researchers to publish their results in open access journals and engage in data sharing initiatives to facilitate rather research collaboration. So adequate funding and resources is also needed, and we need to source this both from philanthropists, from in-country, and not only thinking about getting it from outside. Of course, grant writing capability is one of the areas of capacity building that we need to do to improve on this. Regulatory harmonization, as I said, to promote regulatory harmonization across African countries used to be a very, very hostile terrain to navigate by sponsors before, but with AVRF, they came together, at least the regulatory bodies in the West African region came together and tried to harmonize their regulatory framework so that when you come to any country that is within the West African sub-region, you are meeting the same regulatory framework and without having to navigate different challenges. Public awareness and education is very important, and long-term commitments, ensure a long-term commitment to the African participation in clinical trials by sustaining funding, partnerships, and capacity building efforts. So, as I said, the clinical trial attractive index of Africa as a continent can be further improved by developing a roadmap for future action in tackling the low volumes in Africa. And what are the different ways? Stakeholder engagement, regulatory streamlining, which I had mentioned earlier, capacity building, research infrastructure development. And in that research infrastructure development, it's important for us to adopt the same strategy of having central facilities rather than having individual investigators trying to own, different aspects of what they need for clinical trials. So if you come to an institution, they have focused clinical trial units. And I will talk about that in the next slide. And you see that this is what we are advocating, that is trials in a larger volume, because it will foster confidence in the sponsors that the data quality is of global standard. The reason for this is benchmarked on the fact that this was exactly what Britain did when they wanted to scale up their clinical trial participation. They found out that by creating focused clinical trial units, they were able to use it to standardize and ensure that all researchers were working within that framework that is operated, the GCP standards and everything that was operating in that clinical trial unit. So we need to also do community funding support, community engagement and public awareness, collaboration and networking, which is the kind of profound one that we did with the ELTIC Genomic Conference. At a time, one of the researchers from Johns Hopkins said, you know, he rose up, he was so impressed with what the students were presenting that he said, I'm employing, was it employing or I'm engaging people? Anybody who is interested in bioinformatics, please come and line up. Actually employing people to be part of what is going on. So collaboration and networking, not only with international institutions, but amongst institutions within the country and within the continent. Data sharing and collaboration, support for investigator-initiated trials. You find that sponsor companies will always tell you that the way to fast track and leapfrog a clinical trial involvement in the African nation is by us, you know, looking into investigator-initiated clinical trials, which will be around repurposing some of the drugs that they have. So they will have an interest in sponsoring it. And again, policy advocacy, monitoring and evaluation, strategically aligning the clinical trial enterprise with the public health objectives of the African nation. So in regulatory streamlining, we need to streamline the regulatory processes and harmonize them across African countries to facilitate efficient and timely approval of clinical trial protocols. I can tell you that our experience in Nigeria has not been very funny. A lot of times we are, you know, engaged alongside with other African countries, and because of the delays that we suffer in our regulatory, with our regulatory body, we end up, the other African countries have already finished recruiting, and we are still trying to navigate regulatory body approval. So we need to have, they need to provide clear guidelines and establish a centralized regulatory body or platform to oversee the review process. And this is what ABREF tried to do. Then capacity building, invest in training programs and specialized training on clinical trials design, research methodology, ethical considerations, data management, and regulatory compliance, and collaborate with international organizations and academic institutions to facilitate knowledge transfer and mentorship. So just before that next slide, I want to talk about community engagement and public awareness. We need to conduct community engagement activities, and this is where we have an issue, because if you have not appropriately, you know, engaged with the community, you will find that your subject recruitment and the subject retention will have a lot of issues. You can imagine where you're paying almost 500 and something thousand naira for patients, and the experience of researchers in effect saying that they are losing some of the patients to follow up. That should not be. We need to look at more culturally appropriate ways to make sure that we're engaging our communities for acceptability. So development of clinical trial units, as I said, is being projected as a strategy by the African Clinical Trial Consortium and will need to be embraced by all African nations as it will become the gateway for addressing pharmaceutical companies' main concern, the big question of data integrity of clinical trials conducting in Africa. Can they trust it? So developing clinical trial units would be one of the answers. So what are clinical trial units? They are specialized biomedical research units which design centrally, and they design and centrally coordinate and analyze clinical trials and other studies. So African Clinical Trial Consortium was given birth to by Association for Good Clinical Practice in Nigeria, and has created a kind of quality management ecosystem alongside with the Clinical Research Center in South Africa, and offering African nations to have at least 2 clinical trial units per each of the 54 African nations. The next one. So in developing strategic direction for the management of clinical trials in Africa, we need to embrace this development of clinical trial units, and to ensure that GCP, which is the mainstay to accredit the quality of clinical trials, is maintained, and to ensure also robust compliance to GCP standards is one of the strong points of the clinical trial units. This is a model clinical trial unit template that we are being mentored by the Clinical Research Center in South Africa. The kind of units we are wanting to ensure that we template in most of our institutions. So the Onsted University of Nigeria Center for Clinical Trials is in the University of Nigeria Enugu campus. It is our first model of a multi-therapeutic quality management ecosystem CT unit. Multi-therapeutic because most of the units that used to be had were, monotherapeutic, just focused on like HIV, AIDS, or malaria. But this time around, it will have the capacity to handle across board most of the disease areas. So it consists of a pharmacy unit, a lab unit, consulting room, 3 beds ward, a nurse bay, a section for BSc class 2 hood, toilet facility. A pharmacy unit will soon be equipped with a pharmaceutical fridge and shelves. So you have the fridge and shelves. Now, another thing you can do is to compile all the different equipments you have within the university or within the teaching hospital, and you present it to sponsors as what is available from that institution. That way, you increase your clinical trial readiness index. So it is the clinical trial unit is usually ready, providing you all that you need to run a successful trial, a one-stop shop, fast-speed internet, friendly attention to details of staff, edge software to manage personnel, facility, and participants in a serene university. This is like advertising on sect. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not profound. You don't need to break the bank. You just need basic things to be there. And the most important aspect of a clinical trial unit is the human capacity, the workforce, and the training that you put into it. So available to you are all the multidisciplinary teams that are in the teaching hospital. They're available to you. You collect all their NIH CV. They're ready so that when a sponsor comes to you, you're able to present any area, whether it's hematology or people in cardiac or people in lung cancer, you'll be able to present them. So another thing that was developed to assist with improving the volume of clinical trials in the African region, and also to increase confidence of the patient population to have knowledge of the clinical trials that are going on. So as patients, if you educate them and they know where to go to find out where clinical trials in oncology are going on, they can themselves actually go and approach those centers to be recruited. This is what is happening outside of the country. Once you come in, I've had Nigerian patients who came into England, for instance, and they had their diagnosis. The first thing that your primary physician will be telling you is to search and find out where clinical trials that will be beneficial to you, is taking place. In terms of capacity building, AGCPN has also partnered with an educational a group that is an international group, ISO certified medical communication company that offers support to life sciences industry and research institutes across their complete research and product lifestyle. And we have some of the modules. We have, in fact, 9 modular training on scientific writing, study design and protocol writing, journal activity, congress presentation abstracts, posters, oral presentation, biostatistics for non-statisticians, and meta-analysis, and also systematic review as well. So you find that this is the current offer that we're having. Apart from the ethical training, we train ethical review board to certify them and get them registered with the NREC, the National Health Research Ethics Committee. And these are the many ways to make sure that your institutions are ready to be engaged by any sponsor. Thank you very much.